Okay. All right, so that's all good. So what I might do, I can move. Oh no, that should be all right. Okay, all right. Well, we should be all right to go. I'm just going to record this anyway. Okay. All right. So if we, I'm ready. Oh, there's one thing I need to do very quickly. Is actually we should be all right.
Yeah, I'm just finishing going through my pages. I'll be really soon.
Yeah.
Well, I was explaining to Arvind, I've done 2 loads of washing, walk the dog.
All right. So you.
And that is the association of words through numbers, because Hebrew is an alphanumeric language where each letter has a numerical value. And the word gematria relates to the word geometry, the measure of the world. Conflict. If one wants to look at this, Rabbi Sachs writes, the truest faith is protest at the evil and the violence and the injustice in the world, and therefore to be religious is to right those wrongs. To understand how to resolve conflict, there is an ancient Jewish teaching that is to save one life is as if to save the world. Therefore the opposite, to take one life, is as if to destroy a world. This is such an important concept. Another one is the idea of forgiveness. Rabbi Sachs also writes that we must learn not to forget the past, but not to live in it. There are so many people who cannot let go of ancient enmities, of disputes, and they happen in all nations, between all peoples. It's human nature. But part of the message of Judaism is to reach that point of healing of the world, which is called tikkun olam, to try to restore that paradisiacal state of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Healing of the world. That's in brief. I mean, I can give you whole dissertations and I've written papers on it, but I don't think you've got time.
No, I think we could do a follow-up. What I'd like to do with this, let me just pause this for a minute.
Send me a little uncut version.
Yeah.
Because they are in Sydney and they've heard me speak as a parent, but they haven't heard me speak on this topic.
Well, I'm going to be editing pretty over Christmas. I think I'd like to do this. It seems. All right. Okay, I think we're good to go. So there's no no real anxiety about this. So I'll just get the first question up.
You wouldn't like to do this instead of me, would you?
Yes, I would. I have not the knowledge, I'm afraid.
Okay. All right. So the first. So thanks, Harry, for taking the time to bring me to the shul, the Jewish synagogue here in Canberra. It's a very special place, and we had a short conversation about the questions. I've got those questions here. Just perhaps to start off, what might you say as an introduction to the interfaith community and the efforts of the interfaith community here in Canberra before we proceed with the main 6 or so questions?
To the interfaith community of Canberra, on what level do you mean? About interfaith dialogue, or about how effective it has been? Or
How effective would probably be a good start.
well, I think in every field of human endeavour there is always room for improvement, and that would be my comment on any human field of endeavour. I've always been very hesitant to put down anything in print for general publication, and there's only one other interview I've done some years ago, because I really hesitate at saying things which could be misinterpreted. Let me say at the outset, before I address the issue of interfaith, there was a famous sage a couple of thousand years ago, Rabbi Hillel, and another one, Rabbi Shammai. And the story is that a potential convert came along to Rabbi Shammai and said, "Would you please convert me to Judaism standing on one leg?" Shammai was a bit of an impatient chap, older, grumpy, probably like me, and he told the person just to go away. Rabbi Hillel was, however, more interactive and said to this young man, "Well, what is displeasing to you, do not do unto others. All the rest is literature, go and read. So anything I have not covered in this presentation, please go and read. The sources are many, but the important thing in Judaism is to find yourself a teacher. Because as we know in the internet age, 2/3 of what is available on the internet is actually not real or not true. So the search in this interactive technological age is harder in one sense. In terms of interfaith, perhaps one of the best comments I can give is from a few years ago when there was a One Canberra meeting organised by the then multicultural minister, and a former multicultural minister asked, is there a better word than tolerance? Because, as I said at the time in response to this question, the relationship where two people only tolerate one another can hardly said to be very close or is likely to have a future. And I said the phrase which Rabbi Professor Jonathan Sacks uses, respect for the dignity of difference. And that aspect of respect for differences is the key to interfaith. And fortunately, the vast majority of people I've met with in Canberra have that respect.
Wonderful. So now, can you outline your thoughts on the contemporary role of religion in our modern community? A lot of atheism is springing up all around, and what is the role of religion in this very diverse community we live in?
Well, I think as a general principle, I would say the mistake that's been made is the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater. People have a very deep misunderstanding of what religion is, what purpose it serves. Let me use this phrase to explain what I'm getting at. Everyone has heard of religion, but very few know anything about it. Yet they feel inclined to comment. It's a bit like someone who's been a patient in a hospital and feels therefore capable of commenting on every single medical procedure and medical research that exists. You know, there's a certain logical non sequitur there. So what I'm getting at is a statement which I used when I introduced the human rights function, which I ran on behalf of CIF and CMCF with the help of colleagues. And there was a phrase from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks which really sums it up. The ethical vision of love of God for humans and of humans for God, translated into an ethic of love of neighbour and love of stranger, is the foundation of civilization and its abiding glory. So when you think about that in civilization terms, what are the problems in the world today? Look at the chaos, look at the war. one can easily put down the lack of love of neighbour and the lack of love of stranger, whether it's what's been done to the Rohingyas or the divisions within religions, the divisions within human society. So for me, what religion does potentially for people is give them what some of my students in my religion and values education classes came up with. They referred to the wisdom texts which give guidance for the pathway in life.
And so that's wonderful. And so you told me once in a conversation that Judaism, and correct me if I'm wrong, I may have this wrong, but Judaism doesn't relegate other religions in any way or define them as being inferior. There are many ways to the mountaintop, I think.
Yes, there are societies, cultures and religions which accept the teachings of others. One of the principles of Hinduism, for example, is an acceptance of the universality of belief in the one God, whatever path it means. It's also one of the teachings of mystical Judaism, that there are 69 pathways for the human soul, and it's up to every soul to find theirs. What you're getting at in your question, I think, is the question of supersessionism. The idea that one religion, by its coming onto the scene, supersedes the previous one, rather than adds to it. By supersessionist, I think one can give an example with the history of Paris, for example. Originally there was a Druid temple. The Romans came, put a Roman temple on top of that. The Christians came and put a cathedral on top of the Roman temple. So you have a supersessionist idea there, and it exists in many places around the world. The importance here of the Jewish teaching is of the equality of humanity, and the whole purpose of the teaching of the, and I say it allegory advisedly because our sages talk about the first book of the Bible, Genesis, as being allegory, symbolism. What is symbolic about Adam and Eve? The symbolism is that we all come from the one human family. Now, if we're made in the image of God, and the ethic is to love God, and therefore love your neighbour and love the stranger, it's a kind of circular aspect which must therefore arrive at the conclusion of acceptance of the equality of humanity. And in fact, in the Jewish parables, Adam is said to have been constructed from the four corners of the earth, from the four coloured soils of the earth. And indeed, looking at that idea of oneness and unity, Eve is said to have been created from the body of Adam. Again, the idea of oneness. Now, whether you want to go into the biological aspect of chromosomes and so on, the reality is that we as humans, male or female, share that same biological origin.
And when it comes to thoughts on religious tolerance, you alluded to that with your the difficulties of finding a workable definition for the interfaith movement. What challenges do you think there are in incorporating the different approaches to tolerance and working together?
Okay, well let me look at one other aspect. There are many people who say that religion causes war and religion causes oppression. I would say that they haven't done yet the classes in elementary formal logic, because what they're really saying is that it's individual humans' interpretation of their religion which can lead them into their misinterpretations of what the divine teachings are in the different religions, you see, to lead them to war, conflict, discrimination, intolerance. That's not what the religions teach. What Judaism says is that we have within us as humans the inclination either to do good or to do evil, and it's up to us to choose to find the right path. There isn't a duality here of people. It's in us the potential to choose the path in life which is meaningful for the sake of humanity.
Wonderful. And Now, this is not on the question list, but is it arguable then, you know, with because your thinking is quite elegant, that we might simply all be observing the same universal being from different perspectives? I'm sure that's not the first time.
Yes, this is a teaching in many faiths. I mean, in Judaism, getting back to your original question, Judaism believes that any good person has a pathway to salvation, to the afterlife. One does not have to be a Jew to achieve that. There are other faiths, however, which say that the path to that salvation or to that place is only through their teaching, through their teachers, and so on. That's not, as I understand it, Judaism's principal message. In fact, there are a number of communities around the world which are now called Noahide communities, where the 7 laws of Noah are observed, not just the 10 commandments which are up on the wall above the ark behind me, but because some of those obtain particularly to Jews, such as the observance of the Sabbath, for example. People may choose to observe the Sabbath, but that's one of the commandments for Jews. In addition to those 10, there are another 603 in the Jewish Bible for Jews. But the 7 Noahide laws deal with the essentials, such as not murdering, not stealing, not doing injury to fellow human. So there are 7 basic laws of humanity, and there are communities that are not Jewish but observe the Noahide laws.
Now, that's fascinating. Now, what if, in the event of someone erring and doing something wrong according to, you know, obvious principles of goodness, arguably, is there a path for atonement in, say, Judaism, or that type of relationship with the divine, or is it a little bit more?
There certainly is. In fact, one of the key teachings of Judaism is repentance, because it's understood that the human instinct is to stray away from the path they're meant to be on. And there are any number of the thousands of books which have been printed in commentaries on the Torah. To my right are the 72 volumes of the oral law, the Talmud. In the ark behind me is the written law, the Torah. And then there are many other levels of literature and thousands of volumes written over the ages. As one Jewish commentator says, the Jews are the most booked out civilization in history, because we start with the word and we keep on talking like I am now. So
that's great.
Repentance is a very significant role. Now, there's one particular holy day period which is called the 10 Days of Awe, which happen at what we call the head of the year, the start of the year. Paradoxically, that start of the year, called Rosh Hashanah, is the start of the secular year. The start of the religious year happens at Passover, Pesach, in Judaism, which is the foundation festival of the Jewish people, the exodus from Egypt, the exodus from slavery, and the love of freedom. Now, Rosh Hashanah, however, preceded by a whole period of penitential prayers, which are called selichot, which stem from the word to ask for pardon, forgiveness, to be sorry. And atonement, by the way, as you know, comes from the word at one, meant to be at one with God. So during this, when Rosh Hashanah starts, Rosh Hashanah is, in Jewish law, starts on the 6th day of creation, when Adam was created. The 7th, of course, is when God rested. Now, Rosh Hashanah is referred to as the Day of Judgment. So this is a period when observant Jews know that they have to examine their life, examine their actions, and for the sins which they may have done against God's law, they ask forgiveness of God. However, for any sins committed against fellow human, we have to ask forgiveness of fellow human. It's not enough just to be dispensed with by asking God. It has to be a personal exercise, a personal task, and it's a personal task which leads to such another so important concept, which is also enshrined in Jewish teaching, and that happened when Joseph was reconciled with his brothers, reconciliation, which of course in Australia is such an important task still.
Excuse me. So with reconciliation in mind, or conflict in general, religion also seems to be arguably the source of great conflict in the modern world. How can the interfaith movement help with conflict resolution?
Well, first of all, talking with one another is a start. Understanding one another's viewpoints, where one comes from culturally, theologically, personally, psychologically, spiritually, is the path to the start of that understanding. One of my interests specifically is language, and I say to people it's linguistic archaeology. So if you look at that ancient greeting in Judaism, Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you, to which the response is Aleichem Shalom, unto you be peace. The Semitic languages are built on 3 consonantal stems. So any word with those same 3 consonants are linked conceptually. As it happens, Shalom is on the same concept line as the word Sholema, which means perfection. Therefore, peace is seen as perfection conceptually. And this is, if you like, embedded philosophically, linguistically, and spiritually. There is another element which we probably won't have time to go into, which is gematria.
Okay, so we are... Yep, we're good. We're rolling. Yep, and rolling. So if you could expand on the idea of the Sabbath.
To give an example of stories from the Bible and aspects of the Bible which are not always understood, take for example the Tower of Babel. Now my background is languages, and from that word, the Tower of Babel, and from Babylon we have the English word Babel, to Babylon, to just talk. You see, throughout history there have been tyrants whose sole interest was to impose their sole will on the rest of the world, on whole populations, and their sole language on everyone else. The ancient Greeks referred to foreigners as varvaresos, barbarians, because they spoke in a tongue which sounded like ba 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 ba. They couldn't understand it. But the purpose of the Bible account of the Tower of Babel is to point out that all languages, the 70 languages of the Tower of Babel, all languages have a place. All peoples have a right to express their cultural and innate difference, but still within a context of unity, because that is one of the essential messages of Judaism theologically. When we say Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's the message, the eternal prayer in Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, the unity. And that unity of God has to be reflected in the unity of people, but that does not mean they all have to be identical, because as I referred back to the creation of Adam, the story is he was created from all 4 corners, from all compass points of the earth. The other important thing which is not understood these days, less so, is the concept of the Sabbath. Shabbat is the word 7. On the 7th day, the Almighty rested in creation. So the idea of that creating a spiritual rest for the world, and I was thinking about that recently actually, we had a few years ago, it hasn't been reinstituted recently, where we had an environment hour, where everyone switched their lights off for an hour. You see, the idea of the Sabbath is not to go to work, not to use machinery, not to use electricity, not to use fossil fuels, not to use energy, to create an atmosphere of spiritual peace and calmness in the world, to be able to unite again with that concept of creation from the very beginning and that state of paradise. That's one of the intentions of the Sabbath, Shabbat. But the ruling goes not only to humans, because Judaism also was the only civilization to bring that concept in of a day of rest, because if you look back to industrial England, it was Lord Shaftesbury who moved to stop the enslavement of children and having them work 16 hours a day, so 7 days a week. In Judaism, and Judaism started as an agricultural people, shepherds and farmers, and so the animals, the beasts of burden, had to be rested on that seventh day as well, fed, rested, to be able to regenerate. Now that principle, interestingly enough, also extends to the land, because in Judaism the sabbatical meant that every seventh year the fields had to lie fallow in order to be able to regenerate. And I recall reading years ago about oranges grown in California which had not a skerrick of vitamin C, because the soil had been so exhausted that the only way those oranges could really, the fruit could really, and fruit trees are very important in Judaism, the soil has to be regenerated. So that concept of the Sabbath applies to all aspects of society and goes one step further in the Jubilee year, which is 7 times 7, 49, the 50th year. Everything also lies fallow and rests. And also included in that, in ancient Israel, is the idea of the return of property at that Jubilee to the community, Yisrael, the community of Israel. So not a question of personal ownership. So that, in brief, is one of the wonderful aspects of the concept of the Sabbath. Now think in terms of the environment and global warming, what benefit could be obtained by the whole of humanity not using those fuels and energies for every week, one day every week. Now, there's another aspect involved in that in terms of where Judaism puts the importance of the environment. There's a story I love telling when there's an anniversary at the Canberra Interfaith Forum Environmental Health and Healing Garden. And it's the story of Rabbi Hanina, who 2,000 years ago taught, if you are planting a sapling and someone tells you the Messiah has come, first finish planting the sapling, then go and greet the Messiah. The importance of what to do in terms of nature and the environment is there. Care for the land. And a lot of people, even religious organizations, misuse the word ownership and custody. The term I prefer to use in acknowledging the indigenous heritage on this land is to acknowledge the custodians of the land. It's an illusion, especially in Canberra with our 99-year leases, to think that we actually own it.
Very good. Now, so personally, are you able to tell us a little bit about you've just covered off a little bit on it, touched that, where the nexus between Judaism and nature, how they resolve, or perhaps I think we might skip that only because
I've covered it in a sense.
You have, yeah.
You see, there are two views in relation to nature. The basic line is there is an anthropocentric view, which is that we are at the center and therefore everything is ours. There's the theocentric view, which I just referred to, which is the indigenous view, by the way, that they are custodians of the land and their duty is to care for it. So I identify with indigenous people in this, in many ways and in this regard, that when I look back at the history of my people, and the history of what is known as the Holy Land or the Land of Israel, where these events, these famous characters, and the story unfolds, there's an attachment that I have to those sites and places which is very similar to the attachment that the indigenous peoples have for their sacred sites. I just thought I wanted to mention that in relation to the Australian context. So the theocentric approach is it all belongs to God. The animals, the land, the earth, but my job as a human is to care for them all.
Very good. Now, for you personally, I know this is a fairly basic sort of question, so we won't delve into it too deeply, but what do you find day to day, say perhaps today or recently, most inspiring about the Jewish faith in the context, I suppose, of living in Canberra here?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm reminded of almost daily, I don't read and study as often as I should, that's why I say almost daily, is the very deep wisdom that I find in the teachings of Judaism, the wisdoms about how to live one's life, the wisdom which teaches us how to deal with negative events that happen, the wisdom that teaches us how to relate to our fellow human beings with love, and as that what I quoted at the outset, that ethic, the love of humans for God and God for humans, translated into the ethic of love of neighbour and love of stranger, for me encapsulates what one of the main purposes of the teachings of Judaism is. Jews, however, one has to say, because of their long history, and we have survived really about 12 civilizations that have tried to annihilate us. Although we are a tiny fraction of the world population, something like 0.04%, we nevertheless try to do our best as a people, those who have a commitment to its teachings, to its history, to improve the world that we live in. And if I can give a little quote from a very famous historian, I just have to pick my glasses up because I've dropped them.
Yeah, I'll grab them. Hang on.
This is a historian, and the reason I quote him for a number of reasons. He's one of the greatest of Jewish historians. His name was Shimon Dubnov. He is a descendant of the Maharal of Prague, a famous rabbi who was said to have breathed life into a clay figure. It's the origin, by the way, in English literature of Frankenstein and those kinds of things. But the idea was at the time to protect the Jews from attack, from slaughter. Shimon Dubnov was murdered by the Nazis. But he wrote a wonderful paragraph which he said, the first part of Jewish history, the biblical, is a source from which for many centuries millions of human beings have derived instruction, solace, and inspiration. Its heroes have long ago become types, incarnations of great ideals. The events it relates serve as living ethical formulae. The 1,000 years martyrdom of the Jewish people, its unbroken pilgrimage, its tragic fate, its teachers of religion, its martyrs, philosophers, champions, this whole epic will in days to come sink deep into the memory of humanity. It will speak to the heart and conscience of humankind and secure respect for the silvery hair of the Jewish people, and hopefully also in humanity for one another.
That is great. Now, the last question I've lost the questions, but I think that the last question
I've got them all here somewhere.
That should be fine. So the last question is, so the interfaith movement Canberra is made up of all these different religions, and the world currently faces a lot of challenges. There's always seems to be difficulties somewhere, and oftentimes religion is drawn into the argument. How do you think we should move forwards, and with the wisdom in all these very ancient religions that we have in the Canberra Interfaith Forum, what challenges and how do you think it's best approached to successfully continue on this important work?
I think the main challenge stems from an ancient Jewish teaching. In Hebrew, the word commandment and deed is the same word. What you are commanded, what one is commanded to do, one is supposed to do, not just words. And there's another element which I've discussed recently with colleagues. There's another word, the epitaph or tombstone, is from the same stem in Hebrew, mitzvah. Mitzvah, mitzvah, mitzvah. So as I said, the linguistic concepts link, just as peace links to perfection, shalom and shlema. Mitzvah, mitzvah and mitzvah, the commandment leading to deed, becomes the epitaph of one's life. One is known by what one has done. There's a humorous anecdote which I like. The Israeli writer-philosopher Amos Oz talked about the childhood he grew up in Jerusalem, and about some of the older folks who talked all day and all night about the need to stop talking and take action. I think that's where we fail. Acting for good, doing what we can. There are Jewish movements, and it's in our teachings. Again, it was that famous Rabbi Hanina, who taught that redemption is brought about by daily acts of kindness. I think that's an answer. It's part of it, not the sole one. Human society is too complex for single answers.
That's brilliant, Harry. I think that's a wrap. So I wanted to go round, actually. I might stop this. I wanted to go around and get some B-roll. It was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Of life. We're a desert people, and we need water is essential to survive more than food. But what is also essential is spiritual sustenance for the human spirit, for the human soul. And I think that's what's being chucked out with the baby with the bathwater. When people don't understand what the essential wisdom, the wisdom text in religion.
Not really. There's no real pressure. I'm doing it sort of just as a bit of a hobby. So
Yeah.
so this is the spoken law.
Yes, the Talmud is the oral law, and what it is, it's a commentary.
Can you take one of the books out? And
Yes. So, for example, if we take, I was mentioning Rosh Hashanah, for example. So, in the oral law, there will be the quote from the Torah about the new year, and surrounding it will be commentaries from different sages over time, from Rashi, from Maimonides, from Nachmanides, and so on. And this one has Hebrew and English to explain what it is that we're reading at, for those of us who are not as knowledgeable as we should be of the Hebrew language and Aramaic. The images used for Torah, the metaphors, for example, there's one here. This prayer is an abbreviation for Eitz Chaim Hi. It is a tree of life for those who grasp it. And its paths are ways of pleasantness, and all their paths lead to peace. Shalom, it's the last word there. So Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, it's an ancient symbol from ancient civilizations, but it's a metaphor for the divine, as is another concept. The phylacteries, there's a whole message involved with the phylacteries as well. And the prayer shawl. You know about the prayer shawl? You were inside the synagogue.
Yes.
Right. And this descends from our time as a desert people.
Right.
Not too far different from the Saudi Arabian princes. 7 times. You may not have seen these put on.
No, I haven't.
No. So we put the that's it, and I put on the tefillin. Now these also stem from very ancient times, and the phylacteries, some have been found, for example, at Qumran and at earlier excavations as well. And the idea is that it's a task to indicate one's acceptance of divine will. Inside here is the prayer, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So this part here is turned to the heart. The idea is to serve with the heart and the head.
Mm.
And there is a ritual with the symbol, because with the straps it forms 2 letters, Shin, and on the back Dalet, Shaddai, which is one of the names of God, one of the attributes of God. And so that's one of the aspects. Tefillin. Then I put one equally on the head, and it's part of morning prayers. It's part of prayers on the new moon, because we have another prayer service every new month, and we observe the lunar months. And so, a female scholar in Kurdistan, who was known as a Ga'orna, a female sage in the 17th century, and was so knowledgeable of Torah that she was acknowledged as one of the significant teachers of Judaism. And her name is the same as the current one of the Kurdish leaders, Barzani, because Kurdistan used to have a Jewish kingdom, as did Yemen. And has been a reality right throughout history. But some people, including some Australian ministers, prefer to deny it.
Mm. All right, that's wonderful. It's kind of nice that we're getting it's informal, and it's kind of I think this is what we want. So
people, I used to talk about one of my academic interests was a Russian Jewish psychologist called Vygotsky, who taught about mediating states of consciousness.
mm.
And those states of consciousness that he was talking about for Jews in Russia was because of that aspect of migration of languages, that they used at least 3 languages. So to acknowledge and serve God with my mind and with my heart, and that's the purpose of that prayer. It's a very ancient rite, and Orthodox Jews, Orthodox men are meant to put them on every day.
Mm-hmm.
Some women may as well. Many of these rites are becoming non.
To anyone you like, and then probably midway next year, maybe we could organise something through CIF to screen it.
The original prayer shawls and the prayer shawls of the priests and so on in ancient Israel.
Well, I'm looking forward to doing this. So in the new year.
But the formula was lost. It's actually has been found to have been done also by the Phoenicians from shellfish, the blue dye. And so because that original formula of blue was lost, there are some particularly observant Jews who will only have black or grey but not blue on the prayer shawl. It's just a little aspect of history, but there are so many little customs. You see, there's Jewish law, halakha. There's also rabbinic guidance, and there's also local custom. So the knowledgeable young Jewish student who finished is a lawyer, UNHCR.
Yep.
You know, even from the time of Moses appointed judges over Israel. And one of the interesting stories is that the advice to do that actually came from his father-in-law, a non-Jew, a Midianite, Jethro, his father-in-law. His father-in-law, however, who acknowledged the God of Israel as the one God, a God without form or without shape. And Moses appointed judges to a discussion of it here, but you won't have time today. Mirror image symmetry.
Well, I am interested in geometry, and that's what I'm sort of roundly.
And I'll write a little note of thank you to the second in the box.
No, this one's yours.
No, it was on the
okay.
synagogue. There's a little box here.
Yes,
under
I just put it there.
You ever been to Jerusalem, Alvin? Every year? Thank you.
I nearly got posted.
There was
First Australian born Governor General, George Isaac and Zolman. Matthew's, it might be worth printing what we have from that evening. So I'll follow it up with Frank Brennan as well.
The yellow star, David, what significance is that? The yellow color.
The yellow was to mark them out. It was something that had been used by the popes in Italy, in the ghettos. The word ghetto in Italian was used in the Middle Ages to identify us with dunces' caps. So that's why when the Vichy government introduced its measures, the response from the Vatican was, there is nothing in these measures which we see would contradict our practice. It's a teacher. Another spelling mistake. Sorry? Another spelling mistake. There should be an A.